Alright, so this is going to be a brief overview of the C++ Gauntlet game that I've made here, kind of giving a brief overview of what I've learned and how I've kind of gone in over my head, as it were. And we'll just start with this, just go down the line here in the files. I'll give a brief explanation of what each of these do and how it kind of works. I'm just going to jump straight into this constants file. I split this out into a separate file because these are like, oh, these are things I'm going to reference in like everywhere in the program. We have a lot of enumeration, so things that are just like numbers, basically. Like I can cast them to integers and I can use them to access arrays, or vectors, which are basically C++'s expanding arrays. They are not your traditional mathematical vectors. I hate the naming convention. I think everyone hates the naming convention, and it's actually a big thing that made me skeptical of using the language at first. But I have found that a lot of things make it not a big deal. You'll find in a lot of these header files I'll be using these using statements, but I don't use the full standard namespace that a lot of people do. I just do take string because of the whole vector thing here. And so there's not any naming conflicts, and people know what are you talking about, the C++ specific vector, or are we talking like actual vectors? So I just have a bunch of constants related to enumerations with status effects for battles. I have some structs, some arrays, and I have arrays of maps, and then an array of vectors here. So I'm making use of as much a good portion of the standard library here, data structure wise, because I wanted to get a good feel of what was going on and what is the best thing to use for what. I did have to put some things into the source file. For some reason, the linter I was using caught these. It was like, you can't have this in a header file, so I split these up into a source file. But this is the same thing. These are constants. This include, make sure it goes, pretty much is associated with that header file. So anything that includes this constants header file will also get everything in this source file because it is in this header file here, such as on this line. Moving on, I'm going to go ahead and go to one of the first classes that I create. So I'm using more features of the language here. I'm using the random library, and of course I've already started to use my constants for imports. This class is not as well documented as I would hope, just because I didn't get around to it yet. But I tried to make things pretty straightforward in the wise of naming conventions, but that is something on it to do. Basically, it's just a bunch of random number stuff. It takes your random device and random number generators and distributions and just puts it on a nice front end for access, and things that are specific to the game as well. So it's much more fine-tuned. I'm not using anything outside the standard library for this. The source for this, you can kind of see the distribution here, and how the threshold, like there's these thresholds for these percentages, and then there's ranges, and then there's more specific things like these weighted coin flips, and getting like enemies to randomly generate, making sure it doesn't go outside of indexes for accessing arrays or vectors. Moving on from there, this one's a much more function-heavy section of the program. There's no classes in this file. It's just a lot of I/O handling, clearing the console, waiting for user input, prompting the user for different types of prompts. And that's basically handled here. You can see I use a lot of that. You see a lot of standard C out, C in. Some weird hacks I did have to do to get things to not break in places. So it's not as nice as I would have hoped, console I/O to be, but if I were to have used an external library like ncurses, this probably wouldn't be that bad. And because it's in its own contained little section, I can kind of rearrange that at a future point if I'd like. And moving on from there, we have more classes. This is the contestant class. It is actually a parent class, but I'll get into that in a bit. And we just have, I'm making sure I'm using public, protected, private. I want to use a bunch of this stuff. However, all my methods are public, just for the sake of that's what made sense at the moment and what I had time for. Everything is pretty well documented here. My text editor is really nice because if I were to go into a different file that references these, I can just hover over it. It'll tell me parameters and returns like that, and it'll give me the full description. And I can generate documentation with this as well. Something that caught me up with C++ is you define methods for classes a little weirdly, especially if you're using a header file. But once I understood the syntax, this kind of made sense. You take the class name, you have these 2 colons here, and then you have the method, and then you implement the method, and it's not too bad. Then we move on to the player. The player is actually in a child class of contestant. It has, again, private and public. It doesn't have protected because protected is something I've found most useful in inheritance. That's its intended use case. And I do make sure I do a couple overwrites here. Just to, there's different variables, like specifically this attacks one. It's handled a little differently. This one's actual data, whereas the one in the parent class is a pointer. So I wanted to handle it a little differently, so that because a pointer doesn't take as much data as a full vector does. So that was for the sake of memory is what that was, but I don't know, might have bit me in the butt. Not entirely sure. Would need to look more into that. And moving on from there, the implementations of these. Oh, also to be noted, I do have some helper functions with starting a new game here. Very heavy standard output and standard input prompt functions, but it's what gets the player set up and going. And then finally, there's the main game. This is where the enemy generation and the battle stuff is done. And then, of course, our main. Basically, we just have this kind of battle loop that happens, and this is not showing all my currently pushed changes, but there is a bigger, wider loop in main, and it keeps generating enemies and spitting them out until, you die, which, as it currently stands, happens pretty quickly because it's not very balanced. It's something that was thrown together, at least in the wise of game balance, but it was a really good C++ exercise, and I really want to continue working on this project and diving into this language deeper.